Today we're talking about the American Revolution. First, we're going to talk about the causes of the American Revolution. The first cause of the American Revolution is the French and Indian War. This war started in 1754 and ended in 1763. After the war, Britain ended in severe debt. The colonies became less dependent on Britain for protection. The next cause is the Proclamation of 1763. This prohibited settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Britain did not intend to harm the colonists, but they took offense to this order. The next cause of the American Revolution is the Sugar Act. This act was passed in 1764, and it raised revenue and increased sugar imported from the West Indies. The next act passed was the Currency Act. This act was passed in 1764. Parliament argued that colonial currency had caused a devaluation harmful to British trade. In 1765, the Quartering Act was passed. Britain ordered that colonists had to feed and house British troops. The next act passed in 1765 was the Stamp Act. This required tax stamps on many items and documents. The Townshend Acts were passed in 1767. These were taxes on glass, paper, and tea. The next cause of the American Revolution is the Boston Massacre. This happened in 1770, and it was a fight between the colonists and Britain. The Boston Tea Party happened in 1773. This was when a group of colonists disguised themselves as Indians and dumped tea into the Boston harbor. The Intolerable Acts were passed in 1774 in response to the Boston Tea Party. These acts placed strict restrictions on colonists, including outlawing of town meetings and closing of the Boston harbor. The last cause of the American Revolution is the boycott of British goods. This happened in 1774 when patriots refused to buy any British goods with taxes placed on them.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the main events of the American Revolution. By 1775, tensions between the American colonies and the British government had come to an all-time high. The breaking point for them was especially approaching in Massachusetts, where Patriot leaders had made a shadow revolutionary government and possessed trained militias to prepare for the British troops that were occupying Boston. The British governor of Massachusetts called for troops to march out of Boston in order to confiscate the American arsenal and capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who is known to be hiding at Lexington. The first event I'm going to talk about is the rides of Paul Revere and William Dawes on April 18, 1775. The Boston Patriots had been expecting and preparing for a British military action for much time. When hearing about the British's plan, Paul Revere and William Dawes set off across the Massachusetts countryside. The two men went different routes because of the risk of being captured. William Dawes left the city through the Boston Neck Peninsula, and Revere crossed the Charles River to Charleston.
Did you know
that Paul Revere never even shouted the legendary phrase later attributed to him as he passed from town to town during his midnight ride? The operation was meant to be conducted as discreetly as possible, since scores of British troops were hiding out in the Massachusetts countryside. Anyway, while the men were riding, patriots in Charleston waited for a signal from Boston, informing them of British troop movement. If the British troops were marching out of town on the Boston Neck, one lantern would be hung from Boston's Old North Church, the tallest point in the city. If the British were approaching by way of the Charles River to Cambridge, 2 lanterns would be hung. 2 lanterns were hung that night, and the armed patriots made their way to Lexington and Concord. Along the way of their rides, Paul Revere and Dawes gathered hundreds of men who armed themselves and set out against the British. Together, Revere and Dawes warned Adams and Hancock upon their arrival. The first battle of the American Revolution was the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. It took place near Boston, Massachusetts. At dawn, 700 British troops arrived in Lexington and came upon 77 militiamen. Heavily outnumbered, the militiamen's commander ordered for them to disperse when someone fired a shot, which to this day has not been tracked to a certain side. When the smoke cleared from fighting, 8 militiamen lay dead and 9 wounded, while only 1 redcoat was injured. The British then continued on to Concord to search for arms. They then decided to burn what little they found, and the fire grew a little out of control. Hundreds of militiamen mistakenly thought the British were intending to burn the whole town down, so they hustled to Concord's North Bridge, which was being occupied by British soldiers. The British fired first, but fell back when the colonists returned the volley. This British gunshot was heard around the world that Ralph Waldo Emerson later wrote about in a poem. For a while after, the colonists simply followed the British troops, but soon attacked and fighting started all over again. They then reached Lexington again, where a huge group of redcoat reinforcements had been waiting. But that didn't stop the militiamen. The commander of the militiamen ordered them not to attack, and the British were able to safely reach the Charleston Neck. The next battle was the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775. 2,200 British soldiers arrived on the Charleston Peninsula and marched to Breed's Hill. As the British advanced, Prescott attempted to conserve the ammunition of the Continental Army, so told all his men not to fire until they saw the whites of the British men's eyes. When the redcoats were within several dozen yards, the Americans fired a ton and sent the British into retreat. The British reformed their lines and attacked again, but the Americans again fired when they were close, and it had the same result. The British came over the hill for a third time when the Americans were low on ammunition, so it led to hand-to-hand combat. Being highly outnumbered, the Americans were forced to retreat, but by the end the Americans had killed more than 200 and wounded more than 800, while the British had killed over 100 Americans and wounded only 300. Another event of the American Revolution was the formation of the Second Continental Congress. It was formed in the spring of 1775. It governed the U.S. during the American Revolution. It was responsible for the Olive Branch Petition, which was a letter to King George III of Britain, asking for a peaceful solution to the problems between Britain and the American colonies. Of course, King George III ignored the letter. The Second Continental Congress is also responsible for the formation of the Continental Army. Congress created the Army and appointed George Washington of Virginia as commander of the Army. It is also rewarded for the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. It was written by Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. It basically said the following: all people are created equally and entitled to certain basic rights like life, liberty, and happiness. The purpose of government is to protect the people's rights. If the government does not protect the rights of the people, then the people have the right to rebel against the government and create a new one. It also lists the ways in which Parliament violated the colonists' rights under the Magna Carta, and it declared the American colonies an independent nation separate from Britain. The last thing it's responsible for is the Articles of Confederation in 1777, which is the first constitution of the U.S. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine published his book called Common Sense. He wrote about the powerful arguments in favor of independence. Many people read this and began supporting independence. Thomas Paine also wrote the book called The Crisis, which encouraged the Patriots to continue fighting even though they were losing. Some even say this is what convinced Washington to attack Trenton. The next battle is the Battle of Trenton in December of 1776. Washington realized that without a decisive action, his army would most likely be doomed, so he planned a surprise attack at Trenton. Washington's men and cannons crossed the Delaware River in boats and then began a 19-mile trek to Trenton in a freezing storm. The Continental Army surprised and captured 900 troops in Trenton. The next battle is the Battle of Saratoga, which was in New York in the fall of 1777. The American army was positioned between Burgoyne's of Britain's army. The troops crashed together south of the Saratoga, and the British army was broken. Up to 86% of Burgoyne's command was captured. 6,000 British soldiers surrendered to the Continental Army in New York. This victory gave new life to the American cause. After this battle, France gained much confidence in America and joined as an American ally against the British. The last battle of the American Revolution was fought on October 19, 1781. It was known as the Battle of Yorktown. Americans declared its independence in 1776, but it took another 5 years to win freedom from the British. The British General Cornwallis brought 8,000 troops to Yorktown and was expecting British ships to be sent from New York, but they never arrived. With the help of the French Navy and the Army, the Continental Army caused the British to surrender, ending the American Revolution.
I'm going to talk about the main players of the American Revolution. The first person I'm going to talk about is George Washington. George Washington was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army who led the Americans to victory. Washington was a much better leader than military strategist. His men lacked supplies and were poorly trained, but they trusted him enough that he was able to keep direction and motivation. Washington led his troops through many battles that should have been extremely hard, but he managed to pull through and win the war. After the Revolution ended, Washington became president of the Constitutional Convention and was soon elected the first president of the United States. The second person I'm going to talk about is Marquis de Lafayette. Marquis de Lafayette was a French man who served as a major general for the Continental Army under George Washington during the American Revolution. Lafayette served in many battles such as the Battle of Brandywine and Battle of Rhode Island. During the middle of the Revolution, Lafayette returned to France to try and convince the French to support the Americans in the Revolution. After his return, he helped to block British troops at Yorktown from reaching the Continental Army, giving Washington more time to better prepare his troops. After the Revolution was over, Marquis returned to France to encourage King Louis to follow America's example of government and freedom. Next, we're going to talk about William Howe. William Howe was a British general who was commander-in-chief of British forces during the American Revolutionary War. Howe's reputation was marked by his assault at the Battle of Bunker Hill and the capture of New York and Philadelphia. General Howe won the Battle of White Plains and went back to Fort Washington and captured 300 prisoners plus supplies. This was a huge loss for the Britons. On April 14, 1778, he retired as commander-in-chief. I'm going to talk about Nathanael Greene. Nathanael Greene was a major general of the Continental Army. Greene was a member of the Rhode Island General Assembly and brigadier general of the Rhode Island Army of Observation. In 1776, George Washington appointed him major general, and he was placed in command of all of the Continental troops on Long Island. In between leading troops to battle, Greene was assigned to take over the Southern Army. While he was in command, the British forced heavy casualties, and his role was very crucial to the eventual British surrender. Samuel Adams was the organizer of the Boston Tea Party in response to the tea tax. In 1774, Adams joined the Continental Congress and signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Adams also helped develop the 1777 Acts of Confederation. Samuel Adams was a huge propagandist against the British and a leader of the Sons of Liberty. Paul Revere was a colonial activist during the war. Revere mobilized colonial activism that led to revolution. Paul Revere is most noted for his midnight ride to Lexington and Concord to warn the Patriots of the British advance from Boston. After the war, Revere circulated his account of the Boston Massacre. Thomas Jefferson was the author of the Declaration of Independence and a founding father of the United States. Jefferson also became the third president of the United States. Thomas Paine was a writer who came from England to Philadelphia and published Common Sense during the war. The publishing of this convinced many people to break away from British rule. Thomas Paine moved a lot of people from a feeling of rebellion to revolution.
I'm going to talk to you about the results of the American Revolution. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the Treaty of Paris. On September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed by the U.S., Britain, France, and Spain, and it ended the Revolutionary War. This treaty recognized the United States of America as an independent country. It also established the new nation's boundaries, which were the Great Lakes to the north, the Atlantic Ocean to the east, Florida in the south, and the Mississippi River to the west. In this treaty, Great Britain agreed to remove all of its troops if the U.S. would pay all of the debts it owed to England. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the Constitutional Convention. Because the new nation needed a centralized government, Alexander Hamilton called a meeting to discuss the problems arising. The first meeting was on May 25, 1787. Representatives from the 13 states were supposed to attend the meeting, but Rhode Island would not send a delegate. These sessions were held in Philadelphia at what is now known as Independence Hall. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787, and it established the new nation's government and laws. It was decided that the new government would have three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Because they didn't want one branch to have more power than the others, they established a system of checks and balances. The House of Representatives and Senate were also established. The House will have proportional representation of states, and the Senate will have equal representation of the states. Next is the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights guaranteed the people certain basic rights, such as freedom of religion, right to bear and keep arms, and freedom of speech. The Bill of Rights became a part of the Constitution on December 10, 1791. After the American Revolution, there were several trials of the new nation. The economy became highly inflated. A huge debt was left after the American Revolution. After the Treaty of Paris, Spain did not recognize America's new borders, and Great Britain continued to have forts in the new nation. The American Revolution had an impact on France. France helped the U.S. tremendously during the American Revolution, causing them to go further into debt. It also didn't become the main trading post with America. Because they didn't agree with their government and gained inspiration from the U.S., the French Revolution followed shortly after.
Thanks for watching!